Hi, everyone, and welcome to B'nai B'rith's expert analysis discussion, Israel's security challenges, what lies ahead. I'll now give the floor to our CEO, Dan Mariaschin.
Thank you and welcome everyone to today's conversation. We appreciate all those joining us from around the globe. Well, Israel's unique position in the Middle East means that it faces challenges that no other nation on earth could even comprehend. With enemies on its borders and across the region, the Jewish state's top priorities will always center around national security. From Lebanon and Syria in the north to Iran's continued malign activities in the Middle East and around the world, and the continued Palestinian-Israeli conflict, Israel has its hands full. That's why I'm joined today by two distinguished Middle East experts, Dr. Kobi and David Makovsky. They'll be speaking with me about Israel's security challenges in a rapidly evolving Middle East landscape. Dr. Kobi is senior research fellow at the Institute for National Security Studies and editor of the Institute's Strategic Assessment. Among his primary research interests are national security and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. He previously served as the Deputy Director General and the head of the Palestinian desk at Israel's Ministry for Strategic Affairs. David Makovsky is the Ziegler Distinguished Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, and he's director of the Koret Project on Arab-Israel relations. He's also adjunct professor in Middle East Studies at Johns Hopkins University's Paul Nitze School of Advanced International Studies, and from 2013 to 2014, he worked in the office of the U.S. Secretary of State, where he served as senior advisor to the Special Envoy for Israeli-Palestinian negotiations. Kobi, David, thanks so much for being with us today. Well, I'd like to start off with the most recent events, last couple of months, the fighting between Israel and Hamas in Gaza. Things escalated quickly in the last round of the war between Israel and Hamas, particularly when Hamas attacked Jerusalem early in the 11-day conflict. Now, besides the open call for jihad and the desire for Israel's destruction, how do you see Hamas's strategic calculations before the fighting ensued? What was the thinking at that time? And was it related in some way to the Abraham Accords? What was behind the thinking here and the calculations in May? Kobi, why don't you go first?
Thank you, Daniel, and good evening. I would say that this was a strategic miscalculation of Hamas. First of all, in order to understand the motivation of Hamas, we have to understand the context of the internal Palestinian arena. We have to remember what has happened there when Abu Mazen decided to postpone the elections, when Hamas was sure that they are going to win the elections. We have to remember what is the end state of Hamas. The end state of Hamas is eventually to replace the Fatah as the leading movement of the Palestinian Authority and the PLO as well. For the time being, they are not members of the PLO, but they intend to become members of the PLO, and this is one of the reasons for the disagreement or the disputes between Fatah and Hamas, and one of the reasons to the absence of any reconciliation between of them. Now, they actually used the context of Jerusalem and the riots in Jerusalem in order, first of all, to embarrass Abu Mazen and the Palestinian Authority and to show that they are incompetent with regard to Jerusalem and with regard to the holy sites for the Palestinians and for the Muslim world. Secondly, they wanted to enlarge the equation vis-a-vis Israel and to add Jerusalem to the equation in order to improve their position among or vis-a-vis the Palestinian constituency. Thirdly, they actually believed, and this was the miscalculation, that the political context that Israel was in will will limit Israel with regard to its motivation to retaliate aggressively. And therefore, they set an ultimatum and they realized the ultimatum and they launched rockets toward Jerusalem. Now, they believed, I believe so, that Israel will retaliate, but they believe that it will be a very minor retaliation and they will be able to contain this retaliation. To say later on that actually they were the first that set an ultimatum, they were the first to realize the ultimatum. They actually are the defenders of Jerusalem and the holy sites for the Muslims, and to continue for with the negotiation with Israel in order to reach to the calm agreement. But as I said, it was miscalculation because Israel retaliated very aggressively and very rapidly, and they were forced to retaliate on the Israeli retaliation, and then we found ourselves in the path towards escalation. Now, at least during the operation and in the first days after the operation, they felt, I would say, almost in a sort of a euphoria that they have achieved very significant achievement. And actually, talking about the cognitive war, I think that they have reached to some significant achievements, but these achievements are very limited. And after 2 months, the operation was in May. I think that they found themselves in a very chaotic situation in the Gaza Strip where the humanitarian situation deteriorated. They are facing criticism from the Palestinian population in the Gaza Strip. And eventually, all the glory and all the so-called political achievement that they have achieved with regard to their position as the defenders of Jerusalem and vis-a-vis the Palestinian Authority are less meaningful than they thought. And now they are seeking to improve the situation in the Gaza Strip, but the problem is that Israel actually decided to change the rules of the game, and Israel decided that what was used to be before the operation will not be anymore, and therefore Israel is not ready to renew the reconstruction process of the Gaza Strip unless Hamas will make progress with regard to the prisoner deal. And Hamas is not willing to do so, at least for the time being, and therefore we are pretty stuck with the Gaza Strip. Although I think that there are some, I would say, there is a sort of progress in the negotiation that still takes place in Cairo between both sides, between Israel and Hamas, by the moderation of the Egyptians. But the gaps are still wide, and I'm very skeptic with regard to the option that these gaps will be bridgeable in the soon future. So, in order to sum up, I would say that Hamas is in a worse position now in comparison with to their position before the operation. I think that when they wake up each morning, I mean their leadership, and they see what is going there in the Gaza Strip, I think that they do regret about escalating the situation and about the provocation that they caused. And it is very similar in this regard to the regret of Hassan Nasrallah in July 2006, the outbreak of the Second Lebanon War, when he said later on that if he knew that Israel will retaliate in such a manner, he would have reconsidered, okay, all the operation of Hezbollah that actually escalated the situation and caused the Second Lebanon War.
David, what's your take, and also would you comment on the issue of the role of Qatar in all of this, in terms of assistance and in terms of their interest? Kobi mentioned the negotiations in Cairo. but there's also a Qatari element. So would you comment on that?
Yeah, I just came from a meeting with a senior Qatari official who's visiting Washington. Look, Kobi and I see it similarly, but a little differently. I think he's a little more optimistic than I am that Hamas is deterred on a certain level. I think to get to your original question, Dan, what brought us to this moment? You have Yahya Sinwar, the leader of Hamas, who's a terrorist, but who was let go in the Shalit deal of 2011. And actually, he had a very Gaza-centric focus certainly since 2018, some would say even 2017, when he became to power. And he cut deals with Israel and Egypt, the UN and Qatar to focus on improving the situation for the Gazans. Of course, he realizes that a ceasefire is good for him because it gives him quiet to do his metro tunnels, that went 500 kilometers around. I just came from Israel and Ramallah, and I talked to a lot of people about the whole situation, including the tunnel piece. And also, unlike 2014, when I was in the government working for the Secretary of State, now you have basically, except for the Egyptian part on the Rafah crossing, we call the Philadelphia Road, there's like a wall underneath the ground with sensors and everything. So they can't smuggle, but they manufacture rockets, within Gaza. So in a certain way, the quiet served them too. It served Israel. Everyone wanted quiet, but Hamas used the quiet to try to exploit it. I think the changing piece, and I agree about that they want to show themselves as a defender of Jerusalem, but also I think, and Kobi alluded to this too, is the local rivalry with Fatah. I think once President Abbas on the Palestinian side canceled the elections, I think Hamas was counting on those elections to deepen its footprint in the West Bank, not just Gaza, where they've been traditionally strong, because in the West Bank, between the PA and Israel, they have put the clamps very much on Hamas. Once the elections were canceled, I think the Hamas strategy turned upside down, which was, Kobi's right. I think, they miscalculated. Maybe they didn't think Israel would go after Gaza because it's been so quiet, but there was a risk. And they decided to take that risk because they want to be seen as the guardians of Jerusalem. Because as you know, Dan, who follows this for so many years, decades, like I do, and Kobi does, whenever you deal with religious issues, it brings people to the streets much greater than politics. Remember the tunnels in Jerusalem in '96. Remember, what happened with the outbreak of the Second Intifada with Sharon's walk on the Temple Mount and how that was exploited. The magnometers, the metal detectors of 2017. Anything with Jerusalem and religion and the Al-Aqsa and the Temple Mount, it brings people to the streets. It just does. So it's a kind of a political winner for them. But I think it comes at that backdrop that Abbas canceled the elections and they shifted from a Gaza-centric approach till now. Now, I agree with Kobi that there's a frustration level. A, they didn't expect the extent of the Israeli response. But B, I think there's a frustration where he sees Sinwar, he thinks of himself, and so many Palestinians and Israelis said, like, he is Salah ad-Din, the great liberator, who was Kurdish, by the way, but the liberated from the Crusades. His self-image has gone through the roof. But the frustration that he can't translate what he deems to be a victory into tangible things for his people in the post-period. So my information is there actually is an Israel-Egypt channel right now on prisoners. And they're talking both sides. They're not talking about heavy-duty prisoners that have, quote, blood on their hands. But there is a prisoner talk because Hamas wants to get whatever prisoners they can. Israel wants to get 2 dead bodies out and 2 people who kind of wandered over the border. So right now, the reconstruction, as Kobi said correctly, is kind of held linked to that conversation in Cairo. And then there's your point, which is a good one, which is the Qatari angle, which is, that they originally had a deal that they're $30 million a month that they were giving to Gaza, which is $360 million a year, that was going through a mechanism of the UN, and some of it went for fuel to purchase for the Gaza power plant. They were 2, 3, 4 hours a day and now they're up to 16 hours a day of fuel for electricity. So Gazans get electricity, and it's hot in the summer, as you know, and that's air conditioning and the like. And they did money, some of it for the indigent, but it went through the UN. At a certain point, and Israel did agree to this, even though the Israelis don't highlight it, at a certain sensitive point, Prime Minister Netanyahu agreed that the money be given directly and not via the UN anymore, but directly. So Hamas wants to kind of have it, their cake and eat it too, to say, well, we want to be able to go to war with you, but we also want the money to come in the suitcases, the proverbial suitcases, because banks don't want to touch money where they could be held up and sued for sanctions. So that, Qatar brings in cash there. Now, the Qataris insist that while the money for the electricity is now back going up, and they're back up, I think, to 16 hours a day, I'm not sure, that they want a mechanism that's with the United States and the UN and them, because they feel that they're being blamed in the Israeli media for giving the money directly to Hamas when Bibi signed off on it at a certain point, even though that wasn't the original deal. So they want all the advantages of the pre-conflict situation without paying any of the costs. And the hope is, like Kobi said, that they will realize that the Gaza people will say, what has Sinwar brought us? There's just a lot of rubble. And maybe the Egyptians will do some reconstruction, but the Egyptians have basically stopped until the prisoner issue and the missing bodies is addressed. So will that lower the numbers for Sinwar? We do know this, that instant polls, where it always shows Hamas spikes up after a round with Israel, after 3 to 6 months, the numbers drop down. Doesn't mean Abbas goes up, but Hamas isn't at the glory moment as they are right after a conflict. So will time once again kind of erode this sense of their narrative of victory? We need to see. I'm just not so sure Hamas is so fully deterred. And these are kind of ongoing issues. There are people who say, do a second round against Hamas. Sinwar's not ready. This guy he's reckless. He's out of control. I had a senior Israeli cabinet minister use those words. We'll need to see where things are. Israel's hoping that with time, people will see Hamas has not granted much to the Gaza people. But the goal is to somehow help the people of Gaza, because you don't want people to live in misery, but you don't want Hamas to be a beneficiary either.
Let me move to the Palestinian Authority. Having been accustomed for so many years to having the floor for themselves, are the Palestinians, and talking about the PA, are they tone deaf to the changes that are taking place around them? And here I'll bring in the Abraham Accords. There was a statement, I think it was a couple of days ago, I think it may have been in the name of Abbas, he may have said it himself, of Abu Mazen, that there were a whole series of conditions that he was bringing up before the Palestinians would return to a negotiating table, return to any kind of negotiation. So the question is, with time passing by, it's now almost a year, we're almost a year out from the Abraham Accords. Why is it that the PA continues to talk a zero-sum game when it knows it really can't turn the clock back? And we've seen the test. The test was during the fighting in Gaza. Or is it that the status quo is just too comfortable for Abu Mazen and for the Palestinian Authority, and that, for them, it just makes sense to keep the wheel turning without any kind of progress? Kobi, what do you think?
Abraham Accords actually were a strategic failure, if not a strategic defeat, for the Palestinian Authority. Actually, the worst days or the worst time that they have witnessed were during the presidency of President Trump. And the Abraham Accords are, I would say, a sort of continuation of Trump plan. Okay, during all the years, the Palestinians actually had a sort of a veto power with regard to any normalization process with the state of Israel. And they insisted that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict or the Palestinian issue should be the first thing that will be set, and only after resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, then there will be a place, or there will be, I would say, there will be legitimacy for normalization with Israel. And unfortunately, for years, for decades, they have succeeded. They have succeeded enforcing their veto power, and the idea that the Arab countries, 4 Arab countries, signed a peace agreement, normalization agreement with the state of Israel, despite the political stalemate. This was huge frustration and huge failure for the Palestinians. And therefore, they are not ready to be part of these agreements. They are not ready to even to reconsider shifting the bilateral paradigm, meaning the Israeli-Palestinian channel, with a multilateral framework or paradigm, which means that they will become to be part of the Abraham Accords, and will enable the Abraham Accords to facilitate the resumption of the political process. Because if they will do so, they will admit in their strategic failure. Now, I think that another reason for their I would say, refusal to be part of the Abraham Accords is the absence of the legitimacy of Abu Mazen and the Palestinian Authority. And mainly in the last weeks after the incident of Nizar Banat from Hebron, when the Palestinian security apparatuses actually executed him. It reminds many people the story of Khashoggi with the Saudis. Okay, it is very similar, and this is the first time that people, I would say, ordinary Palestinians, actually went to the streets and demonstrated against the Palestinian Authority. And I think that this is the first time for many, many years that the Palestinian Authority, that the security apparatuses of the Palestinian Authority felt that they are facing a real danger. A real danger. I have heard even words about collapse of the Palestinian Authority. Okay, and after the last operation that we have talked about, and the glorification of Hamas and their, I would say, position in the eyes of the Palestinian constituency, the situation of the Palestinian Authority and Abu Mazen is, I would say, is very problematic. I mean, when very few percent of the Palestinians say, yes, in the last polls that were taken in the West Bank and Gaza, that they will vote for Abu Mazen or for the Fatah, and there are more than 70% that demand that Abu Mazen will resign. He is in a very, very problematic situation, and therefore he is not able to make any meaningful concessions vis-a-vis Israel. I don't think that he is ripe for any meaningful concessions, but even if he is ripe for such concessions, I don't think that he will dare to do such concessions, because he will find himself out of the Muqata, if not worse than that. And therefore, I think that we are facing a very, very severe problem. I mean Israel, okay? Because the preferable partner of Israel is the Palestinian Authority, not Hamas. Hamas is a terror organization. We are not able to reach to any sort of peace agreement with Hamas. And it is much easier for Israel to deal with the Palestinian Authority because we have an agreement, because we are used to work with the Palestinian Authority. We have a tradition of cooperation with the security apparatuses. We have a tradition and history of cooperation with regard to civilian affairs. And Israel prefers to work with the Palestinian Authority. And therefore, Israel needs a functioning Palestinian Authority and very stable Palestinian Authority. And Israel wants to support the Palestinian Authority, but the problem is that Israel, by supporting the Palestinian Authority, actually goes against the general mood of the Palestinian constituency. And this is something that reminds at least some of us the principle of political engineering, something that Israel doesn't want to do anymore in the Middle East. Actually, we have failed during all the years to deal with political engineering, okay? And therefore, Israel understands that it has to strengthen the Palestinian Authority, but it has to find the right way to do that without creating a sort of clash with the Palestinian constituency. And it is a very complex mission.
David, like Kobi, you're a longtime watcher of the PA. We are reaching a point here. Abu Mazen is advanced age. It seems also with a tenuous health situation. It's been written about, talked about quite a bit. So what do you see transpiring now over the next couple of years within the context of my question, which was nothing has happened here for the last 4 years. Abu Mazen decided, for whatever reason, to sit it out. Now he's making demands about going back, and yet time is kind of passing us by with it seems the growing strength of the Abraham Accords. So where do you see it going?
It's a great question, Dan. Look, having been in Ramallah and talking to people right around him and in the close circle, I sense a little less confidence than, seeing projected outward. I think they see there's like kind of a double whammy, kind of like almost a pincer thing coming at them. I felt that they don't mention the Abraham Accords. From what I hear to people who talk to Abbas directly, he still can't get over the Emirati support for his rival Dahlan. He talks about Dahlan, not about the Abraham Accords, as something that they're out to get me, and it's personal and this. And it's not as much about that they're trying to pull the rug out by diluting my leverage, but it's more about seeing Dahlan as a threat to his rule. And so I think it's more personal in a certain way. When you say Palestinian Authority, it sounds very institutional, but it's one guy. And I think, you're right to zoom in on him, because I think he's the guy who has this anger with the Emirates about the Dahlan, the guy who was his rival, who's living in Abu Dhabi. I saw him when I was in Abu Dhabi. So I think there's that piece. Then you've got what I was saying before about the Sinwar phenomenon, with the instant polling showing how Sinwar is now the guardian of Jerusalem. And what did the PA do? They didn't fight the Israelis there. They sat it out. As a matter of fact, Ohana, the police minister, I think said, I could divert troops from the West Bank to Lud and Akko, different Israeli mixed cities where there was strife, because it was relatively quiet. Doesn't mean there weren't protests. It doesn't mean there wasn't scattered things. There were, but the authority kept their word. And, I think that's important at a time of crisis. So I don't think they have all the swagger that they're the only game in town, but it's like, this very bad dynamic between Mohammed bin Zayed, the head of the UAE, and Abbas. And Abbas, it isn't, like I said, I really don't think it's Abraham Accords anymore. I think it's just this anger about they're housing my biggest rival, Dahlan, and he can't get beyond it. And then they're feeling the heat with Hamas. And where the PA comes in now more institutionally is this. And this links to our previous round that you asked Kobi and me, is that I think Abbas it seems to me that they're saying, look, Sinwar wants to cash in his chips. He feels he won in his mind, his narrative. Again, Israel did all these amazing military things with Iron Dome to stop attacks on its citizens, stop drone attacks from Hamas, etc. But he thinks he won, but he can't translate this, and it drives him crazy. But he, in his bargaining with the PA, is trying to say, listen, I deserve to come into the PLO for free. Now, to American ears of B'nai B'rith or some other words, who cares about the PLO? It's about government. But in the minds of Hamas, this is a time of succession. They wanted unconditional, that they could come in and basically take over the organization. And there's no way Fatah is going to allow that. because they know what a sensitive time of succession it is for all the reasons you said, that he's 86 years old, not in the best of health, sometimes smokes 2 packs of cigarettes a day. And they're going to say, what, I'm going to let him leverage what he sees as his victory in order to take over the PLO at the time of succession? No way. And their view is Hamas has to pay. What does it mean, pay? It means that you sign all the agreements that Israel and the PA agreed to. In other words, you have to recognize Israel. And they go, it's suicide for us, the PA, to let these guys in for free, where they'll say we made no compromises. We're finished. And I think they see it again through a local lens of rivalry with Hamas. So I think it's this combination of two forces, which is, you think the Emirates are housing your rival, so you're upset at that. But now you think Hamas wants to leverage its May performance into a political achievement where they don't pay anything in terms of their ideology to take over the organization precisely at the time of succession. And for this, the PA says no. And by the way, Israel obviously agrees with them, but as Kobi said correctly, since 1982, Israel's learned it's very hard to engineer Arab politics when you're a Jewish state. So Israel's happy that the PA has taken on this battle for their own sense of self-survival.
Well, in the second half of our program, we've got a lot of territory to cover. So we're going to move now to Israel's neighbor to the north. It appears that Lebanon might be on the verge of an economic and beyond that, a collapse of the state. Hezbollah essentially controlling Lebanon as it is, as a part of Iran, Inc. So we have perhaps it's a failed state already, and it could be even more of a failed state. Given the increasing and rapidly shifting instability on Israel's borders, coupled with the reality that the players in question on the north and also in the south with Hamas are Iranian terror proxies, what might we expect to see in the coming months from the Israeli security establishment? In this particular question, though, looking at Lebanon as it deals with its difficulties. So, David, why don't you take that first?
Sorry, look, I think, and I'd be curious to hear Kobi's view. I think Israel's been always most focused with Lebanon on its what they call PGM, Precision Guided Munitions Program, that was pushed by Qasem Soleimani, who's no longer of this world, and which he saw is to convert kind of dumb rockets into smart missiles that could hit any place in Israel with an accuracy of like 10 meters. And they've got like triple digits that they're converting here in terms of this program. So at a certain point, there's going to be, I don't know what that point is. You'll hear next year is the year. I mean, who knows what's real or not. There's been a kind of almost a mutual deterrence between Israel and Hezbollah since the 2006 war. All the killing's been done in Syria. There's some sense that Hezbollah is developing some anti-aircraft capabilities in Syria, and that's where a lot of the attacks have been. But Lebanon has been quiet. But I don't know how long that's going to last with this PGM program, because Israel cannot afford that Hezbollah has that sort of capacity. So something's got to give at a certain point. What I also don't know is the economics, and that is, look, the Lebanese people are furious with Hezbollah because of the ammonium nitrate in the Beirut port. And it's sad, it's heartbreaking to see, but there's no other word, but I'm sorry to use the phrase, but it's a failed state. And what I don't know is, do the Palestinians who are in refugee camps in Beirut and places around there, if they lose their jobs because the Lebanese economy stops functioning, do they move to the south? And does that have like security implications? I don't know. But I just think the PGM is the main thing. The fact is that the Lebanese people also talk about frustration. They know Hezbollah is to blame, but there's nothing they can do because they're not in charge of their own country. And it's very, very sad, and Hezbollah, because of their Iranian backing. I mean, if you were Lebanese and say, okay, what's wrong with this picture? Our side in Lebanon is with the Iranians. We've got a failed economic state. The Israelis are cutting deals left and right with the United Arab Emirates, and their GDP per capita is now like Japan and France and big European countries. So somehow the Israelis have figured out with the Arab states how to start working together and have a more prosperous future. Doesn't mean they have it with all the states, but the Lebanese people could not get Iran off their back. They're furious at Hezbollah, but what does it help them? So it's a tragic situation. If you know Lebanese people, it's very tragic, and Israel is just feeling, well, got to deal with it. Not looking to fight, not looking for wars. What they're doing in Syria is because if you didn't like the book in Lebanon, you don't want to see the movie in Syria, which is, Hezbollah entrenched itself and you couldn't get rid of them. So Israel's determined not to allow Iranian entrenchment in Syria. So right now there's a mutual deterrence of sorts. Israel doesn't use that phrase, of course, but I don't know how long it will last. I think this PGM is the real story. It doesn't get any headlines in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, but I tend to think that that quiet between Israel and Lebanon is not going to last indefinitely, given that program.
Kobi, after the explosion in the Beirut port, there was that unrest. People were in the streets. It was one of those episodes, and we've seen it before in other places where we've seen it in Iran actually in 2009 in the streets, where there was this kind of gasp of where the people were out, they'd had it with Hezbollah, and then it kind of receded. Why do you think that unrest did not pick up any traction?
Because, as you said, and as David said, Lebanon is a failed state in a very high degree of state failure. Unfortunately, all of the Arab states that are surrounding Israel are failed states in different degrees of state failure. Jordan is a failed state, and Syria is a failed state, and Egypt is a failed state, and the Palestinian Authority is a failed state. The problem with failed state is, first of all, the absence of monopoly over the organized violence of the central regime. Secondly, a very significant weakness of the central regime. And thirdly, a very problematic social and political fragmentation and the absence of political and social mechanisms that enable the society to deal with political and social disputes. In addition to that, talking about Lebanon, we are talking about Hezbollah as the ultimate proxy of Iran. And we are talking about a very bizarre situation that, by the way, it is also related or connected to the previous topic that we have talked about, the relations between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority. Actually, what Hamas wants, Hamas looks to the north and they see Hezbollah as a model, okay? And one of the reasons for the failure of the reconciliation talks between Fatah and Hamas, between the PA and Hamas, was that Hamas refused to be part of the Palestinian security apparatuses. They want to preserve their military capacities because they know that by their military capacities they will be able to control effectively the Palestinian Authority, even without being the official ruler of the Palestinian Authority. And this is exactly the situation in Lebanon, where Hezbollah actually rules Lebanon. I mean, it is a paradox, or as I said before, a bizarre situation where Hezbollah, from the military point of view, is much, much more stronger than the Lebanese army, okay? Actually, the Lebanese army can do nothing without the permission of Hezbollah. And we see the most robust UN peacekeeping force, which is UNIFIL, okay? More than 10,000 peacekeepers from, I would say, leading European countries, Germany, Spain, France, you name it, which is incompetent vis-a-vis Hezbollah in South Lebanon. They are not able to realize their mandate. And therefore, talking about Lebanon and trying to relate and to answer your question, I would say that actually there is no any accountable and responsible address that the people can reach to and can ask for any sort of, I would say, solution or action with regard to the situation. I think that Israel is in a very problematic situation because Israel can do nothing with regard to the Lebanese problem. Israel, by itself, Israel alone cannot assist Lebanon. I think that the only possible solution, if we can talk about solutions, is something which is actually dependent on the American administration and the Arab world. If the American administration, together with the Europeans, will be able to declare that they are willing to assist Lebanon and to reconstruct Lebanon, but under the condition that Hezbollah will immediately stop all the production process of the PGM that was mentioned by David before, okay? And the Arab world, mainly the Gulf countries that have the resources, will commit to support Lebanon, okay, under these conditions, then all the pressure will be on Hezbollah, okay? Because if Hezbollah will refuse to accept these conditions, it means that Lebanon is lost, okay? And then Hezbollah will have to tackle the Lebanese constituency. But the problem is that there is no, I would say, basic solidarity among the Lebanese constituency, among the Lebanese people. It is such a fragmented society from the societal point of view and from the political point of view. I mean, we have the Druze and we have the Christians and we have the Sunnis and we have the Shiites, okay? And even among the Druze and the Christians, there are many factions that are not able to cooperate together. So it is such a lousy situation, it's such a problematic situation that I'm really skeptical about the option that something good will come out from Lebanon. And I think that eventually we will witness one of the two. One option is a total collapse where Hezbollah, which means Iran, will take control over the state. And the other option is that Lebanon will be divided to more than one country after a very bloody, bitter, and long citizen war.
Dan, can I just throw in here
Sure.
real quick? So I have this podcast called Decision Points. We just passed 50,000 downloads. And I did an interview with this fellow of ours at the Washington Institute, Hanin Radar, with David Schenker, who was the Assistant Secretary of State for all the Middle Eastern countries, like 22 embassies, and about the relations of how the Lebanese people see Hezbollah. And Hanin's house was blown up, her apartment in Beirut at the port with the ammonium nitrate, where people blame Hezbollah for. But it was really, again, very heart-rendering, how the Lebanese people, they're furious at Hezbollah, but they feel impotent to make change because of the Iranian dominance there. So I think Kobi and I, it's called Decision Points, and you could hear it in the last episode. But I think Kobi and I see it very similarly, and it's a tragedy of how the state cannot bring itself together. There's no cohesiveness. And because of the Iranian influence and the people in Hezbollah, the people who kind of fire the shots, call the shots in a certain way, and they're not able to bring themselves together. The French have tried a lot, President Macron, there have been others, but so far the resistance by the Iranians and Hezbollah has been just too strong, and the people who suffer are innocent civilians. It's tragic.
Well, in the time remaining, I do want to talk about Iran. It's been mentioned throughout the course of this discussion. Iran has begun producing enriched uranium metal, further violating the original agreement. Almost monthly, we hear, and sometimes more than once a month, we hear from the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA. It announces another disturbing fact about some activity that the Iranians are engaged in, nuclear-related activity. It continues the Iranians to test missiles. They are extorting sanctions relief for IAEA safeguard implementation. All of these things are happening. So it leads to several questions. And the first would be, does this not demonstrate, let's say, to the Europeans and especially to the United States, the very fact that Iran has every intention to continue not only its nuclear program, because that's what the JCPOA is about, but also all of its other malign activities in the region, which we've discussed. And why are the Europeans and the administration so inclined to return to a negotiating table with a partner that has, frankly, since the administration took office in January, gone through an entire list? It's more than probably fills several pages of issues relating to non-compliance with the JCPOA. And now, and the final question would be, with the election now, I'm hesitant to say hardliner because I don't want to get into the hardliners and the moderates, because on most of these issues, those distinctions are really not important. But for the purpose of discussing Raisi, we'll talk about just his role as Minister of Justice and all that he did really against his own people. So he is really someone who brings a lot of baggage with him to the office. So given all of this, is a new agreement bigger, better, whatever? Is this really is it all a non-starter, given all of the tripwires that have been tripped upon over the past 6 months? So Kobi, you go first.
First of all, I'm not sure that there will be an agreement. I think that although the American administration and the Europeans are very eager to resume the negotiation and to reach to the second JCPOA, I'm not sure that the Iranian are in the same page. Okay. Secondly, even if the Iranian will come back to the negotiation table, I'm not sure that the gaps between both sides are bridgeable. And thirdly, even if they will be able to bridge the gaps, I think that even the second JCPOA will not stop Iran from reaching to military nuclear capabilities. At least I think that this is the working assumption in Israel. Okay, I think that the Israeli strategy has been changed in this regard, and the new government is not willing to clash with the American administration. Understands that by confronting the American administration, it will not be able first to influence on the American administration. Secondly, it will not be able to influence on the JCPOA itself or on the negotiation process. Therefore, I think that Israel changed its strategy, and it looks for ways to cooperate with the American administration and to reach to understandings with the American administrations with regard to the day after the JCPOA, and I would say to shrink the gaps between both sides with regard to the reactions that should be taken in the case that Iran will reach the red lines. I think that Israel will continue building its military capacities because Israel must be ready, to the worst case scenario. I think that this time the building process of the military capacities will be done in a very close cooperation and understanding with the American administration and with the American security establishment. I think that we are going to see a very, very close intelligence cooperation between both sides. And I think that if Israel will reach to the conclusion that nothing can help anymore, I will say that Israel might consider a sort of an alliance with the United States in order to improve its deterrence vis-a-vis Iran. Israel doesn't like the idea of official alliance because it has its limits and its obligations. But if Israel will reach to the conclusion that there is no any other better option, I think that this option is on the table as well.
And David, let's go back to Raisi. I mean, here you have a new president, a hardliner, close to the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei. One almost felt that when we read that news after the election, that the options for the administration, not to mention Europeans, but the options for the administration had closed, and that expectations really necessarily had to be recalibrated. How do you see it?
Look, you're asking great questions, Dan. I don't know if my answer is as good as the questions, but it seems to me, look, this is the kind of the part of the debate, and that is, if there's no deal, some would say Iran is very weak, and with passing time, they'll be weaker. So why the rush to a deal? The other view goes like this: they've just done this 25-year-old commitment now in March for a relationship with China, to provide China with the oil it needs, and China will find ways to get it hard currency, and therefore they're not in such terrible shape. And if there's no deal, maybe it's good for them because they can withstand the sanctions and their situation. They can now enrich at 60% and just keep going. I think how you interpret their weakness is really the core to the debate. If you feel that Iran is only going to get weaker with time, then why give them the life raft, to rescue them from that? If you feel that they're not in a weak position because of this deal with the Chinese, then the question is, maybe you want the deal because, as Kobi kind of alluded to, the way I read into it is what I heard in Israel, which is, okay, this is the only deal. It's a one-off. There's no longer and stronger deal, which is what everyone said they aspired to deal with all the issues that we all talk about: a longer sunset on their enrichment. I mean, sunset means the phasing out of restrictions, the ability to focus on ballistic missiles, the ability to deal with the R&D of advanced centrifuges that spin the nuclear fuel, the unfettered access of nuclear inspectors. All four of those deals was supposed to be part of a JCPOA 2.0. So those who say, look, at least if you lock in JCPOA 1.0, the 2015 deal, the advantage is there's at least over 2,000, some say 3,000 kilo of enriched uranium for enough for 3 bombs, and they would have to ship that all out of the country. So you would gain that advantage. But if you think basically that the ideal for Israel would have been to withhold all the sanctions relief, meaning nothing on hard currency about oil exports, nothing on reintegration in the banking system, and nothing about access of Iranian assets abroad in bank accounts. If you were able to hold all that back, they would have an incentive to go for a 2.0, a better deal, a longer and stronger deal. But right now, the focus is stopping their ability to get close to a bomb now. Maybe it's 3 months away. Of course, they have to weaponize, so it's a little longer. But so this question of how weak is Iran is a big question. And are you giving away too much leverage early? And that's going to make it harder later, make it maybe impossible later. But there were some I met in Israel that kind of surprised me, very senior people in the defense system who said, look, we might not like this, okay? But as Kobi said correctly, we're not going to get into a fight with the U.S. Been there, done that in 2015. There's no percentage for us to get into a big public clash. We tell our views very bluntly, very candidly, privately. We don't have to do it publicly. But, that school says we'd love the 2.0 deal. If we're not getting it, then a bad deal is better than no deal because it'll give us a breathing space of 5 to 6 years. So there is a pro-Vienna school. It's not maybe pronounced, but it's there. And it's in much more senior positions than I would have thought. The other approach is to say look, Raisi is all, was a butcher of dissidents, killed thousands. He signed off of them in the late 80s, 90s. He knows people, he is what he is, but maybe he knows he's weaker than they know, but he wants to put his signature, his stamp on this deal, that this deal will be a Raisi deal. I'll get a better deal than Rouhani got. Because again, all politics is local. Coming back to a theme we talked about on the Palestinian issue, that's what Tip O'Neill used to say. All politics is local. I will show that I got a better deal than Rouhani. In which case they are coming around to at least a 1.0 deal. But if there is a deal, it does hold out itself as a bridge. So Israel could reorient itself to upgrade its deterrent, to do all the things that Kobi said. Very close intel, scenario building, maybe use some of the new ties with the Arabs for joint regional defense, missile defense, anti-drone defense. Use the 6 years. Who uses time the best, Israel or the Iranians? So we'll have to see if it's going to go there. But if there's no deal, you could say, well, maybe it shows Iran is weaker because they do need a deal. But it also could be the other thing. It could accelerate the thinking here. Joe Biden just told Ruvi Rivlin, who was the president of Israel till 2 weeks ago, was public. He said, not on my watch. Now, some people thought, well, he's talking about JCPOA. It runs out in 2028, 2030. He finishes in 2028 if he wins 2 terms, which is unclear. But, but what if there is no deal? And now in Iran, kind of accelerates, all the timetables accelerate. And in a certain way, it gets really, I don't want to use the word interesting, sounds a little mild, but it could be a bit concerning that both the US and Israel are going to have to deal with an accelerated timetable. A bad deal, and I want to be clear, I'm not endorsing Vienna. I don't know all the details on the inside. I want to be very cautious. But I do think the advantage of the Vienna deal is it could be a bridge for Israel to, you're talking about what this means for Israel, which is your question, and I'm saying in terms of Israel, for 5-6 years to rejigger, reconfigure, reorient itself to get ready for what could be a military confrontation. It doesn't mean it's for sure an attack. I'm not saying for sure it's a countdown. I'm just saying that these are analytically, these are very different scenarios that we have to look at. But it's based on what your assumption is. Does Iran feel weak? Does Iran feel it has to cut a deal and or not? And we'll see with this new government. It's not clear. And I'm sorry to go on about this, but I think we just have to put it all out on the table.
Well, some of us, and we've really run out of time, but I just want to make this point. Some of us felt 6 years ago, certainly the nuclear issue very much at the center. But we were asking questions at the time, well, why don't you do 3 baskets? If you're going to have a negotiation, deal with the malign behavior and the terrorism, deal with the human rights issues led by people like Raisi in his time, and deal with the nuclear. And you have 3 baskets and you're able to tie it up. Now, what you have here, even if you have whatever it is, 2.0 or bigger and better, or whatever it might be, you're still going to wind up with the Iranians solidly entrenched in Lebanon, solidly entrenched in Syria, solidly entrenched in Iraq. They're still firing at our forces, not to mention the Houthis, and not to mention Hamas, Hezbollah, etc. So I think the original sin here was not it was to have put off these other issues. And even if you have this nuclear deal now, dealing with missiles and dealing with centrifuge and so forth, you're still going to be left with the others. So, I mean,
sure. I was not a supporter of JCPOA, so I'm not trying to defend a position I took then. Look, the one thing is I remember 2015, I remember the Israelis, 2013, 14, 15. saying the Iraq plutonium reactor was about to go hot. The nuclear issue was above and beyond anything else. That doesn't make the Israelis, they were supportive of JCPOA. They were not. But they were the ones who said you can't solve it all at once, all at the time. And the truth is, I don't see the Ayatollah getting up there and saying, mea culpa maxima, I was wrong about Hezbollah. I think ultimately, and I know this doesn't sound PC to say what I'm about to say, but I think when it comes to the regional thing, there's going to be no substitute for dealing with it on the ground and pushing back that way. I'm not calling for conflict. I'm just saying that I don't think the Iranians are ever going to say we were wrong about Hezbollah. We're going to pull back on Hezbollah. I just think that's why the U.S. and especially Israel, I think they have a very clear-eyed view that you're going to have to push back on the ground. I wish you could solve all the problems at once, by the way. I'm not, I'm just not with the Ayatollah. I mean, they're terrorists, and I don't know. I'm just not too optimistic here.
Kobi, you get the final word.
I think that that having this conversation, we understand that eventually and actually Israel faces huge security challenges, and we have not mentioned and we have not discussed the domestic challenges, okay, with regard to the relations between Jews and Arabs, talking about the last operation and what we have witnessed in the streets of the mixed cities. We have not talked yet about the COVID-19, the fourth wave of the COVID-19, and we have not talked about politics and governance and so on and so forth. So without being too gloomy, I would say that that Israel faces challenges in the scale of superpower, okay, but is very small. It is still a very small and teeny country with limited resources. But I think that at the end of the day, Israel has to prioritize its challenges, understanding that Iran is the most crucial and the most dangerous one. And Israel has to calm, okay, the other fronts, which means that we have, first of all, to calm the Palestinian front. Then we have to rebuild the strategic relations with Jordan. I think that the new government has begun with that. Jordan is a very crucial strategic asset for Israel. We have to strengthen the relations with the Arab countries and to add even additional countries to the framework of Abraham Accords. And we have to devote a lot of efforts and goodwill in our domestic issues, because the resilience of the Israeli society is something which eventually will be the most crucial one when we will have to tackle all of these challenges. Till now, the Israeli society is very resilient. I think that it has been proved in the last operation vis-a-vis Hamas, but not only there, even with regard to the COVID-19. But we still have work to do. And, at the beginning of the conversation, when David asked me, how are you? I told him that I wish for a more boring days.
Well, unfortunately, we have run out of time. But Kobi, David, thank you for sharing your insights on Israel's unique security challenges going forward. It's been a privilege to have both of you with us today.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Bye.
I want to thank Kobi Michael and David Makovsky for being with us today and talking about what security lies ahead for the Middle East's only democracy and the world's only Jewish state, the State of Israel. It's been great to moderate this timely discussion with you. A recording of this conversation will be available on demand on our YouTube channel soon, and be sure to visit our website, b'nai-b'rith.org, to learn more about the work of our organization. I want to thank all of you for joining us, and I hope you'll return for future B'nai B'rith expert discussions. Until then, for my guests, I'm Dan Mariaschin. So long from Tel Aviv.